There is nothing wrong with protest marches as long as they're peaceful and there's no violence from either extreme. I think both sides in Gaza and Israel are behaving abominably. Everyone's a victim of someone. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighters. We are going to look after security on behalf of humanity and the Aryan race in Poland, in Hungary, in the Netherlands, in Belgium, in France, and probably in many other countries too. This is Sloane Square in London. I love Sloane Square. I discovered the Rocky Horror Show on the second night in the theatre upstairs at the Royal Court Theatre here, where if it rained, the show had to be cancelled because the sound of rain drumming on the metal roof actually completely concealed the dialogue of the play. So everybody had to leave and go outside and sit at a nearby cafe, have a cup of coffee and be sad that they'd not managed to see the wonderful Rocky Horror Show. I want to discuss the Rolf Harris show, Hiding in Plain Sight, that was on ITV on the last 2 weeks, and I thought was absolutely a disgrace. As it happens, I'm having lunch today with a very high-profile victim of false allegations. I've made an awful lot of friends who are victims of false allegations. And I'll discuss the Rolf Harris case in more detail later on in the episode. But for the moment, the reason I thought it was an absolute disgrace was because it didn't show any balance whatsoever. Now, of course, the programme makers will say, but it makes a better programme not to have to put the other side of the story across. But I don't object to the fact that they took one side. I just object to the fact that they didn't put the other side, and there should have been balance. As it happens with the Rolf Harris situation, a friend of mine wrote a brilliant book which he researched thoroughly, which put the other side of the story across. You can get it on Amazon and in all good bookshops. It's by William Merritt, and it is actually superb and required reading if you want to know the actual facts behind the cases. But in the meantime, I'll leave you just with that thought as we take a look at London. This is the cocktail bar before we go into the restaurant at the 108 Brasserie in Marylebone, which is superb. You may remember I complained about the Prince Charles Cinema cancelling the premiere of my film last year, The Great Reset. Well, if you take a listen to the lyrics of this song, perhaps they had good reason. This was a song called Tribute to Great Leaders, sung by a small group of young girls for one of those audition shows on reality type shows on TV. I think it's very funny. See what you think.
President Kennedy licked my clit, and you know I have to admit I really rather enjoy wishing to appear alarming. I thought him rather charming. Ayatollah Khomeini came on me in Paris when he was younger, and to be honest, it appeased my hunger. Osama bin Laden got a huge hard-on, like many Muslims do. Wasn't gonna wait for all them virgins to start emerging two by two. Prime Minister Edward Heath fucked my son. He was extremely partial to the sight of a sailor's bum. My man Blue President Charles de Gaulle, he wasn't shy at all, at all. All of these leaders are bottom feeders. One tough guy in times of stress used to come all over my dress. Made one hell of a White House mess, but didn't cause me any distress. There's something about these leaders of men, they choose to do it again and again. Must be something in the water to make them do what they shouldn't order. President Kennedy licked my clit, and you know I have to admit I really rather enjoyed it. Comrade Stalin called me darling, and not wishing to appear alarming, I thought him rather charming. Ayatollah Khomeini came on me in Paris when he was younger, and to be honest, it appeased my hunger. Osama bin Laden got a huge hard-on, like many Muslims do. Wasn't gonna wait for all them virgins to start emerging two by two. Prime Minister Edward Heath fucked my son. He was extremely partial to the sight of a sailor's bum. My man Blue President Charles de Gaulle, he wasn't shy at all, at all. All of these leaders are bottom feeders. One tough guy in times of stress used to come all over my dress. Made one hell of a White House mess, but didn't cause me any distress. There's something about these leaders of men, they choose to do it again and again. Must be something in the water to make them do what they shouldn't order. There's something about these leaders of men, they choose to do it again and again. Must be something in the water to make them do what they shouldn't order. There's something about these leaders of men, just to do it again and again. Must be something in the water to make them do what they shouldn't order. There's something about these leaders of men, they choose to do it again and again. Must be something in the water to make them do what they shouldn't order.
Well, someone's got to say it, perhaps not. There are so many things wrong with the Rolf Harris In Plain Sight ITV series, which was a two-parter. I seriously suggest you read William Merritt's book, On the Other Side of the Rolf Harris Story. I know nothing more than what I've read in that book and in the media and observed from afar. I met him 3 or 4 times, I suppose, during his career. Seemed like a perfectly decent guy, didn't really get to know him very well. But looking at the circumstances and looking at the show, one thing becomes clear. He was not guilty of any kind of rape or sexual offence, apart from doing something which was in many ways a bit unforgivable. But these days, I think you look at it and you go, these things happen. And that was essentially having an affair with his daughter's best friend after she became 18. I think it's quite significant that he admitted that and didn't claim that it was after she was 16. That rather indicates to me the absolute truth of it, because if he had actually been having sex with her when she was younger, it was still completely legal, if fully consensual, over the age of 16, and he would have said that. So the very fact that he said she was 18 indicates to me that she was indeed 18. And the affair went on for 10 years. Now, the woman says that during that period of time, from 18 to 28, she was incapable of removing herself from his control. I'm sorry, I think that's absolute rubbish. I think it all broke up in the end when she was 28. It was rather sad because he was much older than she was, but it was not criminal. And I don't think even it was a moral offence. When people, women or men, get to the age of 18, they're quite capable of deciding with whom they want to have a relationship, especially one that goes on for 10 years. Looking at all the other false accusers, most of whom he was found not guilty of in the series of trials, and indeed on appeal, if you read the book, you'll see that several of the charges that he was found guilty of then got thrown out and he was declared not guilty of them. Looking at them all, I think most of them genuinely believed they were assaulted. But when I say assaulted, it's a very minor assault. It's not rape or anything like that. In my book, what I would think as rape, he basically, for example, there was the blind girl who said when she was interviewing him, and she was 16 or 17 on the equivalent of hospital radio as a charity thing, when he met her, he gently took off her glasses and said, "You are actually a very beautiful girl." Now, I have to say, I think that was meant, probably, in a very kindly way, and I suspect there was no malicious intent whatsoever. As the years have gone by and she's built it all up in her little head, I think she said, for example, on the show, she said, taking the glasses off absolutely abused her because the glasses were her protection. They were very dark glasses, obviously, since she was blind, and they sort of concealed the fact that she was blind. The reality is, I'm sure he meant well. With most of the other things, including that, when he, for example, massaged people's shoulders and held onto their hands for too long and all that kind of thing, very reminiscent of the allegations against Jimmy Savile, again, most of which were hugely exaggerated and some of which were entirely false, in my opinion. I think Rolf Harris was a very touchy-feely man, clearly, and all of that was clearly something that some people did back in the day, as it were. I remember that era of the 60s and 70s, and indeed I've got a story I'll tell you in a moment about George Harrison of the Beatles and groupies in the 1960s. But for the moment, that's my thought on the whole Rolf Harris saga. And because, of course, it was such a great story and the media inflated it even more and continue to do so now he's dead, by the way, it strikes me as actually a travesty. You'll say, well, it doesn't matter, he's dead anyway. I'm sorry, it still ruins the lives of all his relatives, friends, and everybody else. And it's just appalling the way broadcasters are prepared to do that thing, especially against dead people, in order to make a programme they think will appeal to people. And the viewers who want to believe the worst, because it's a better story, and they can sit there vicariously thinking, what a vile man, taking advantage of his fame and celebrity that we gave him by buying his records and watching his TV shows. I'm terribly sorry. Bollocks. Another celebrity sex scandal that erupted involved the famous diver and gorgeous young man Tom Daley and his husband Dustin Lance Black, who was accused, his husband, of actually assaulting a woman in a nightclub by grabbing hold of her wrist and making her spill her drink all over her. It went all the way to court, where the evidence was heard, including the woman giving her testimony, and the judge stopped the trial, threw the whole thing out. We refused to allow them to go any further. It was absolutely clear this is yet another case of false allegations. Yes, it didn't actually involve sex, although I believe it was a gay bar they were in. But the woman who works in media, you'll notice, and this is one of the great new things, media, especially social media, although I think she was also an occasional presenter on BBC Three, not anymore, I would think, if they read about the case. But it was just appalling. The whole thing was so obviously another false allegation set up in order to get lots of media publicity, raise the profile, possibly make money and all the rest of it. ghastly, but it's actually more serious than I mean, if you read about it, you'll find it the most trivial and stupid kind of case. It should never have been brought by the Crown Prosecution Service. It was prosecuted. The whole case was eventually thrown out, having cost Dustin Lance Black an absolute fortune, I would imagine. And I hate to tell you, Dustin, if you watch these shows, and I believe you do, it may well cost you much more, because now the corrupt bent lawyers who chase people even after acquittals will now get on to you because they know you've got lots of money, mostly Tom Daly's, I'm afraid, and they will actually hit you with civil suits where this ghastly woman will say her entire life has been affected, her career has been affected, that basically the whole thing has ruined her life, and even though he was found not guilty of doing anything, the entire thing so wrecked her life that she will demand an enormous amount of money, please, of course, for which the lawyers, who will be working on a no-win, no-fee basis, will grab 50%. And this kind of thing is totally widespread these days, admittedly much more common on dead people, where their estates are sued. And the estates usually shrug their shoulders, settle up, because they weren't really expecting to inherit the money anyway. They don't particularly care, and they'll fork out, probably not for the enormous sum asked, but for a percentage of it, and just shrug their shoulders. Well, I think it's appalling. I think it's a crime. False allegations is the biggest spreading crime in Britain and the world today. Back to The Great Reset and my lyrics. I think the best lyric I've ever written is this one. In the film, our hero, Kenneth Halliwell, is talking to Jimi Hendrix about talent shows that appear on television these days.
It's almost like there should be a celestial talent show in heaven for all pop stars to take voters instead of ye old, ordinary punters.
It was a hot July day in heaven, and the sky was blue below. All the citizens of paradise were attending the Celestial Millennium Talent Show. Last time they had witnessed a real surprise when the architect of Petra had won instead of the favourite, the Egyptian sculptor Thutmose, for his bust of Nefertiti's head. Chaucer was there for the Canterbury Tales with the creator of Sydney's Opera House Sales. King Lear was a contender, as was Bleak House and the man who designed the computer Matt Mouse. Aristotle got there late, he had trouble parking and sat down between Lowry and Philip Larkin. Picasso spoke to Rubens, Sophocles with his mum, but Dr. Viagra sadly couldn't come. A hush fell and God announced the two finalists, The Death of the Virgin by Caravaggio and The Statue of David by Michelangelo. There was the expected uproar and the odd supportive cheer. Jean Genet walked out pale, shaken and feeling a little queer. Rachmaninoff hissed to Beethoven, the judges must be deaf or dead, and Beethoven was heard to reply, what was that you said? Several felt they should have chosen Heroes Gateway Arch, and the stuffed church favoured the man who'd invented starch. The Scots championed TV and John Logie dared, whilst others whispered softly, thank God we were spared. The Orientals considered Hockeside's Great Wave very good, but Van Gogh felt a chair was the better use of wood. The Statue of David won, of course, by a mile, though Da Vinci felt he'd deserved it for that smile. When Caravaggio met Michelangelo at the Celestial Millennium Talent Show, when Caravaggio met Michelangelo at the Celestial Millennium Talent Show. When Caravaggio met Michelangelo at the Celestial Millennium Talent Show. When Caravaggio met Michelangelo at the Celestial Millennium Talent Show. When Caravaggio met Michelangelo at the Celestial Millennium Talent Show. When Caravaggio met Michelangelo at the Celestial Millennium Talent Show. When
I promised you the story of George Harrison in the last episode and got such an enormous reaction to the John Lennon exclusive that I gave you. A really very trivial detail, but one which a lot of people seem to latch on to. No, by the way, John Lennon was not gay, just rather like me, open-minded. So back in the 60s, there used to be something called groupies. Now, in the new morality and the rewriting of history in this century, groupies seem to have been forgotten. Groupies were basically young girls, mainly teenagers, who were absolutely in love with pop stars. We were very big at the time, pop stars, and who desperately wanted us to remove their virginity. They wanted to lose their virginity to a famous pop star. This was generally not for financial reasons, i.e. suing people, paternity suits and so on. It was actually because they adored famous people, and famous people were usually attracted to them if they were good looking. At the age of consent, remember, was 16 for girls, although for men it was not at all, actually. In the middle 60s, any kind of gay sex was completely, totally illegal, a crime, usually prosecuted and quite often ending up in death or suicide. But back then, it was generally accepted that, men liked to sleep with girls. It was sort of the way the world was. And some of the groupies were very young indeed. Many of them had boyfriends, but they didn't want to lose their virginity to their horrible, spotty teenage little boyfriends. They wanted to lose their virginity to major pop stars. So groupies absolutely flocked everywhere. I remember some people almost made their entire sex life about groupies. Mark Bolan, who got to be quite big, I knew him when he was with T-Rex in the very early days, and I raved about one of their records, Deborah, and he came over to my house to thank me for it. And I got to know him very, very well, and then became enormous, and he used to tell me all the time about the groupies who gathered outside his house, some of whom were 12 or 13 years old, and who he just selected one every now and again, brought her in, and had sex with her. And he thought it was one of the wonderful perks of being a pop star. I remember in Bob Geldof's biography or autobiography, he wrote how the only reason he became a pop star was because in those days you could get to sleep with girls, which otherwise was rather difficult for young men. Anyway, one of the groupies who used to come to everybody's house if they could find out the names of the house was an appalling little girl of about 12. She was black. Is one allowed to say that these days? She was incredibly ugly, with a very sort of pointed nose and buck teeth and everything. And she used to ring on the doorbells and bang and knock, and you'd open the door and she'd be standing there smiling sweetly at you, and she'd say, "Hello, are you Jonathan King?" And I'd say, "Yes, can I help you?" And then the most appalling invective stream would come out of her little mouth, and she'd go on and on about how you were vile, untalented, every record you made was awful, you were ugly, you looked ghastly, you were a pervert, you fancied young girls. until you slammed the door on her. And she did this regularly. Anyway, one night in one of the clubs, I think it was the Scotch of St James, George Harrison came in and said to us, all the assembled multitude of everybody who was there, hey, you're all going to be buying me drinks all night tonight. And we said, really? Why? And he said, well, earlier on today, that awful little girl who used to come and ring all our doorbells and insult us like mad arrived for about the third or fourth time at my home. I think he lived in Weybridge at the time. It was dead easy to get to people in those days. And she rang my doorbell and I opened it, and she was standing there and said the most appalling things. And after about a minute's worth of this invective, I punched her in the face, broke her nose, which was bleeding. She clasped her hand to her nose, rushed away, and I don't think any of us will ever be seeing her again. And we all cheered and bought him drinks all night long. Can you imagine that happening in 2023? Have you been following the COVID inquiry? I find it absolutely fascinating. I have to admit, I thought Dominic Cummings came out of it rather well, actually. But one thing is absolutely clear, not only through that, but also through reading the excerpt from the appalling Nadine Dorries book, that the system, the establishment system of ministers, politicians, MPs and so on, is completely broken. Now, looking at COVID, we all know it was actually a very difficult situation. And I have a lot of time for the people who were involved, the Boris Johnsons who actually got COVID, and the Dominic Cummings and all the other people, the ministers, the civil servants and all the rest. It was sort of a pandemic that had not been thought of before, that was actually a huge problem that was going to kill lots of people, and nobody really knew how to cope with it. Except the one thing that nobody mentions is it wasn't nearly the killer plague as inflated by the media. From the moment it started in China, I watched the media inflate this into a killer plague. What was it? Well, it was actually a form of coronavirus, rather like flu is, that was very, very lethal, or could be very lethal, to the vulnerable, which mainly were very old people, or just even slightly old people like me, I have to say. People who are not that healthy, in my opinion, people who smoked cigarettes, even if they'd given it up because their respiratory systems were not working well. And it was a nasty new virus that could kill those people. But it wasn't particularly dangerous to the vast majority of people, and everybody overreacted because the media hyped it up into being a global killer plague, and all governments who are these days completely ruled by the media, be they dictatorships, democracies or whatever, all went along with it. The only government that behaved reasonably sensibly was Sweden, who dealt with it pretty well without panicking and without overreacting. If Sweden had also been sensible enough to think, do you know what, we need to really look after people in care homes and hospitals because that's where most of the vulnerable are, they would have had even fewer deaths. As it was, their economy was not badly affected and they didn't have many deaths. This is never mentioned in the inquiry, hasn't been so far, and I'm sure will not be in the next leg of the inquiry. The media, inflation and exaggeration of COVID. If only somebody would raise that, it would open every single fucking door. So that's it for this episode of A Victim Bites Back. Look forward to seeing you for the next episode of A Victim Bites Back.